Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. One of my guests today is Stephanie Bowen, the editor of the award-winning Wilson Quarterly, or as we call it in-house, the WQ. And regular viewers will know what that means. A new digital issue has hit the virtual newsstand. The Fall 2022 WQ, as strong as our weakest link, strengthening global supply chains in a rapidly changing world. Stephanie, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So happy to be here, John.
And congratulations to have a new issue ready to go. I want to introduce our second guest, who is one of your contributors. And then Alden will ask you to sit tight while we talk a bit about the issue. She is Alden Wicker. Alden is an independent journalist who writes about fashion sustainability. She's also the founder of EcoCult, a leading international information hub for shoppers and industry professionals. Her upcoming book is titled To Die For, with a D-Y-E, How Toxic Fashion is Making Us Sick. It's going to be published in 2023. Alden, welcome. Great to meet you.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll talk about your great contribution to the issue in just a moment. But Stephanie, if we can begin, as we always do, with having you provide our viewers with an overview of the new issue.
Sure. Thanks, John. It really is a full issue. And what's interesting about supply chains is you think you have learned everything, and you think that, we've covered it all since the pandemic really brought supply chains to life, but there's so much to learn, and there's so much that still needs to be done. And we have a wide variety of articles that really help explore what needs to be done to secure our supply chains. We cover a lot of policy issues and things that are happening in North America, across the world, but we also look at a small business in Montana and what kind of innovations they're doing to help other small businesses challenge or weather supply chain challenges. We look at families planning supply chains in Malawi and what can be done to strengthen those and how it impacts daily lives. There's really just a wide variety of issues. We have contributions from so many of our experts in the Wilson Center, from the Canada Institute to the Mexico Institute, to the Asia program and beyond. It's really something. I was struck that so many of our programs really intersect with supply chains, from the environment to energy to geopolitics, and just everything intersects. Supply chains affect everything.
You know, supply chains are almost like the ultimate case study in complex systems and what the ripple effect if something goes wrong. And I think, like you said you learned a lot about them in recent years. I think the whole world did, because instead of just walking into a supermarket or hardware store and seeing the product you want, suddenly you were seeing empty shelves, and we became aware that something was amiss. Is it fair to say that there were vulnerabilities within the supply chains before the pandemic, but the pandemic just exacerbated all of that?
Yes. And it's also fair to say that there were, I'd say, a handful of people that work on supply chains and that were out there saying, listen, we have to pay attention to this. We have to pay attention to this. And when the pandemic came along, it was one of those wake-up calls for people who were hoping it would just go away. And I think one of the things that I want to make sure, a point that gets made from this issue, is just because some supply chain issues have eased since the pandemic does not mean things are back to normal. And it does not mean that we don't need to focus on supply chains, because every single expert we talked to said there is still so much work that needs to be done. There's going to be a future worst case scenario, and we're not prepared for it. So that's a big theme.
Well, Alden, let's bring you into the conversation. The title of your article is Could the Uyghur Human Rights Crisis Finally Force Fashion to Reveal Its Supply Chain? The subtitle goes on to say, Block blockchain technology has long promised to democratize information, new legislation might finally push the fashion industry into a new era of transparency. And that's where I want to begin. I want to ask you about this concept of transparency. When it comes to manufacturers and their supply chains, has it been a case of they would not reveal all of the gory details, or they could not because they themselves were even operating somewhat in the dark?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. So it's actually really hard for a fashion company, especially since they really aggressively started outsourcing in the 90s, to know, I mean, they probably know who the official factory is that they're sourcing the final product from, but they could be subcontracting. And then you have the mill, the dye houses, where the zipper's from, where's the thread from. It really fractures very quickly and it goes all over the world. And these factories, they're not state of the art data collection centers. It's really hard to get them to reveal who their supply chain is for a variety of reasons. Some of them nefarious, and some of them because they don't want to be undercut or reveal their own secrets. But the other thing is that, these fashion brands know that they have a problem, but they want to avoid legal culpability by when something does come up saying, oh, well, we didn't know. We had them sign a contract saying they wouldn't do this. And so we're just going to cut ties and everybody can move on.
So these multiple layers you describe, it might be, 10, 12 layers of, when you talk about individual parts like a zipper, very difficult to track. Is there any movement afoot or any technology available that somehow will make that possible?
Yeah, so there has been a movement for a long time towards transparency, but it hasn't really gained a lot. There's a few fashion brands that have revealed their tier one, as it's called, supply chain, a few that have revealed it down to tier 3 or tier 4, just a handful. But, blockchain was supposed to be this, the silver bullet for this. We've been told for at least 7 or 8 years that blockchain would be the thing that would allow us to verify that cotton sold as organic is actually grown organically, but it never really happened. And I think one of the reasons why is that, technology costs money, and fashion brands are notorious about being penny pinching. And when I say penny pinching, I mean that literally. If it raises the cost of a product by a penny, they don't want to do it.
Well, and consumers want that, right? They want affordable or even cheap goods.
Yeah, they do. I mean, I think there's some elasticity, as we've seen in the past year, around what consumers will pay, but it's almost like a game for some of these sourcing agents, right? They're judged on how aggressively they can negotiate down prices. And so when they come to their superiors and they say, hey, we have this traceability technology, it's not really much of a business case for it, but it's the right thing to do, that's a hard sell.
Yeah, the right thing to do with a price tag, as you mentioned. What I don't want to assume knowledge, and I will be honest, I am not that familiar with blockchains, just sort of broad brush knowledge. Could you tell us what blockchain technology is and what it promises to do?
Sure. Okay. So I'm not a technology expert, so I'm going to do my best here.
But I'm passing the buck to you anyway. So
So blockchain is this system where all the information that is input into the blockchain, if you imagine sort of a metaphor of like it's called a ledger, but like imagine a sheet of paper where, traditionally you would say like, okay, we've received the shipment to our factory. We're going to sign for it. Here's the address, blah, 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 blah. Well, someone can go in later and cross it out, white it out, like do all these things to it because it's just paper. They could destroy it, create a new one. They could forge it. Blockchain is this system where you input the information and it's stored on so many different computers that cross-check with each other that nobody can go in and meddle with it. So the idea of bringing blockchain into fashion was to say, look, if we record that the cotton was put into a gin in Gujarat, India, and you're saying now that this cotton is from Xinjiang, China, we know that something's not adding up here and we can investigate it further. It's not foolproof, like people can input wrong information, but the fact that it can't be meddled with later is a huge step in the right direction.
Yeah, a lockbox of sorts. Stephanie, I know you have questions, and I just want to assure Alden, the editing is finished, Alden. She's not going to be changing any words. She just wants to ask a few questions about the article.
Well, I always want to know, when you were doing this story, when we were initially talking about it, we came at it from a different angle, I think than we were initially thinking. And I'm just curious what you learned, as you were putting the story together that changed your view about, this technology and this legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I came into this story and I was very, very cynical about blockchain, especially because most of what we heard in the past year or so is like it's a Ponzi scheme, it's all pump and dump, which is like when you hype it up so you can make money and then you dump it later. It's needlessly complicated, it's just for tech bros. It's creating all this wealth for a few people. And so I was curious as whether this could be the test scenario that we've always been told about, how blockchain is going to improve the world and like Web3 can do all of these things. That maybe this was the thing that it could do. The answer at the end of all my reporting was potentially. It could do that. It has the potential. We'll see how it's implemented. But will it improve the world for everybody, including, cotton farmers or silk farmers? Maybe not.
What do you think the biggest, obstacle is to that kind of change? And, I think we should step back a little bit actually and talk about the legislation, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that, your piece is centered around, and how that legislation, pushed for these changes. And, is it enough to bring about the kind of change that consumers really are asking for these days?
Hmm. Yeah, so I always remember it by one of the people that I interviewed, one of the officials I interviewed at the Newark port, called it ooflapa, which is kind of corny, but yeah. So this act sort of flipped the way the U.S. government was looking at the issue of forced labor. So before this act went into place, um, it was sort of like presumed innocent until proven guilty, right? Like you had to go with a lot of irrefutable evidence that something is made with a particular shipment is made with forced labor in order to impound it, destroy it, send it back, do whatever. This act said, like, look, we know that forced labor is a problem in Xinjiang. It is so enmeshed in the supply chain of, especially cotton and tomatoes are two things that came up a lot, that there's like, we can make a safe assumption that anything coming out of this region is probably tainted at some point, if not several points, by forced labor. And when we're talking about that, it's the internment and almost slavery of the Uyghur Muslim minority in China. So they're working in prisons, essentially prison factories, as a sort of forced re-education program. And so the United States decided like this was a step too far, right? And so they said, we're going to assume that it's tainted by forced labor, and if it comes out of this region, and it's the responsibility of the importers to prove that it's not. And so that was a huge thing, because suddenly all of these shipments are coming in and they're being stopped. The boats are just like hanging out offshore, which is costing the importers and the brands and the retailers money. And they're scrambling to find out a way to prove that the cotton products that they're sourcing are not from the region and have nothing to do with forced labor.
I want to ask you about the range of problems that would emerge if transparency were the coin of the realm. People think about what we've just been talking about, Uyghur forced labor or other exploitive labor practices. But I'm looking ahead to your book. Is the word toxic to be taken literally? What are some of the other problems that are associated with a lack of transparency?
Yeah, there's a lot of problems. So there's forced labor, but also, yes, the subject of my book is about literally toxic chemicals that are used in our fashion. And you might not have ever thought about this before, but so many of our consumer products have ingredient labels. Food, obviously, cleaning products. but fashion does not. And we wear it against our skin. And about 1 in 5 people suffer from some sort of chemical sensitivity or asthma or eczema. This is a huge problem. And as consumers, there's no way for us right now to know whether or not something that we buy is going to cause a reaction in some way. And so supply chain transparency can help us figure out, okay, where was this made? Was it made in a place with regulations? Was it made in, was it grown without pesticides, or did it harm the farmers? Was it in a tannery with good controls in place, environmental controls in place? Did it pass through a factory that is fair when it comes to labor? What chemicals were put on there? Like all of this information can be encoded in the blockchain. And then in sort of an ideal world, instead of having a tag on your clothing that's 1,000,000 miles long, you would just scan it and you could go in and look for the information that's relevant to you as a consumer.
So let's imagine a future where all of this is happening. Beyond price, there could be some implications for the price of the products on the retail shelves or hangers, as the case might be. What other impact would transparency have on the consumer end of the equation?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, consumers say they want this information, and usually it turns out they don't really want this information. It's
They'd
sort of
rather not know?
Yeah, they'd rather not know, or, they have other priorities. It's a fire hose. What do you do with all this information? There's a lot of really lovely brands that will let you do this right now, right? But they're the kind of brands that are like, our wool was lovingly harvested from the fields of New Zealand, and then it was sent to this like heritage factory in Scotland, and where it was woven and then, shipped to you. And that's a beautiful story to tell. But what we really need is we need the opposite. We need to know the bad stuff that is going on. And what this will really benefit is watchdogs and activists who need this information in order to take action. And they can distill this information down and give it to consumers, like organizations like Remake, which advocates for garment workers in the supply chain. They do a really good job of taking information that they can find and packaging it into campaigns that can move brands to do better. And so I think consumers, instead of, we're not going to have all these consumers scanning and like sort of reading the book of where their stuff has been, but they might end up seeing more. They might be able to just absorb and learn more about where their clothing is from, and according to what their values are. Are they vegan? Okay, great. Now they know whether something actually contains an animal product.
Is it possible to generalize about the response from manufacturers and brands in this regard? Do they want more transparency? Do they say they do and not really? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there's a few brands that do want more transparency. And this might be surprising to some people, but H&M is one of those brands. Other brands that have been more transparent, Timberland actually has been really transparent. People can go to Fashion Revolution's website and they can see actually all the brands ranked by transparency, but this is all voluntary. And so we have a system now where the brands who are more transparent are being punished, because whenever something happens in a factory, H&M has so many factories in the world that if something happens in a large factory, it's probably linked to H&M somehow. But every factory has several clients. And so the clients who are hiding that information are getting away scot-free without sharing anything or being linked or having protests or anything around this. Like same thing with Adidas. They have worldwide protests this week, but there are a lot of other brands that are sourcing from the same factories as they. So we need to get into a system where they are compelled to share that information so that we have a complete picture instead of just sort of, going after the brands to stick their necks out.
Yeah, that punishing the people trying to do the right thing. That's unfortunate. Stephanie, back to you.
Yeah, one of the things that really interests me about your piece, Alden, is that you hit on these huge themes that really are seen throughout the rest of the issue. Themes like trust, transparency, values, and what it just strikes me that this one narrow lens of the that you have taken for this piece really can be extrapolated to, many other big policy issues. And I just, I guess that was a statement, but my question is, you know, do you see more changes like this really coming to fashion and coming to other aspects of the supply chain? And
Yeah.
how do you think that'll happen?
Yeah, I do see this happening. I mean, it was actually a surprise that this happened in the United States because frankly, the United States has been very, very far behind the European Union in terms of advocating for more transparency, ethics, sort of encoding this into legislation and into policy. But when it happened, it was, a lot of people who've been um, advocating against forced labor in the supply chain were absolutely thrilled. I mean, if this works, it could provide a blueprint to tackle so many other ills and issues that are in not just fashion supply chain, but seafood and electronics and all of these different things that span the globe and can cause so much destruction to people, to planet, to ecosystems and animals. So it was a huge thing, but there's also a lot going on in the EU. I can't even keep all the different proposals and initiatives straight that are happening in the EU right now. But one of them, which was proposed in several different countries so that the EU took it up at the European level, is called due diligence. So it's saying that, look, you can't claim you didn't know because we are requiring you to know. You need to know where everything is. And if you say you don't know, that's not going to shield you legally from being held accountable for what your subcontractors are doing, for example.
And who's driving these changes? Is it the activists that are really driving the changes, or is it the companies or policymakers or some kind of combination? I mean, how do these changes come about?
Yeah, I think it's mostly activists. Like I said, there are a handful of companies that are sort of showing what's possible, but they're not really cogitating on the legislative end, right? Like they're marketing this to the consumers, they're getting together in forums and talking, patting themselves on the back, but really it's the activists and these NGOs that are pushing this agenda forward.
Well, thanks, Alden and Stephanie. I feel compelled right now, Stephanie, you know this, in addition to the outstanding issue that you've just released, and Alden's contributions, also her work as founding EcoCult and her upcoming book, To Die For, How Toxic Fashion is Making Us Sick. Another resource for those of you interested in supply chains and all of the various implications we've been talking about is right here at wilsoncenter.org. One of the unintended consequences of the pandemic, frankly, is that this has become a new focus for the center, led by our VP of new initiatives, Duncan Wood. And so if you come to the Wilson Center, there's plenty more content in this regard as well. And we have a tradition here, Alden, where we put Stephanie on the spot. And before we end the discussion of the current issue, we ask her to look ahead and give us a sneak peek of what she's planning for next time around.
Well, given that I don't know exactly what we are planning for next go around, I will put in an additional plug for Duncan Wood and his work at the Wilson Center, because he has a couple of pieces in the issue. One is a great framing piece that talks about the transition of what really went into driving supply chains from the financial bottom line to the value and values bottom line. And he also leads a great conversation with the former Undersecretary of Commerce and a head of policy at GM to talk about some of those really tricky policy issues that we've discussed a little bit with Alden. But it's a great issue, and you're right. There are so many resources at the Wilson Center, and I think the issue puts them all together in one spot. So,
and how do people subscribe?
Just go to wilsonquarterly.com and subscribe. It's free, and we don't spam your email inbox, I promise.
And that's .com, not .org, like it's yes. wilsoncenter.org, but wilsonquarterly.com. So I want to make that clear. Thanks, Stephanie. Great work as always.
Thank you.
And Alden, great to meet you virtually. And thanks for your contributions to the issue and also for being our guest today.
Thank you. I had a great time.
Great. Excellent. Thanks to everyone. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, that you'll go read the Wilson Quarterly, and that you'll join us again next time. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.